I have done a bunch of videos on this channel answering the question of what do the belts in Jiu-Jitsu mean. I thought today it would be fun to see if we could answer the question of what do you need to know at each belt level in Jiu-Jitsu? What should your focus be at white belt, at blue belt, at purple belt, and so on? Let's talk about it. Introducing the BJJ Old Guy Ultimate Bundle. 3 courses, over 7 hours of material. To commemorate the 3-year anniversary of the Art of Skill channel on YouTube, I'm offering the bundle for 60% off. And if you use coupon code OLDGUY, you'll get an extra 10% off. That's crazy! Just visit rickellis.com and look for the BJJ Old Guy Ultimate Bundle. White belt, probably the most underappreciated of the belts in Jiu-Jitsu, and it can be the hardest belt, honestly, in the sense that you have to swallow your pride, swallow your ego, work up some guts to walk into a school for the very first time, knowing that you're probably going to have a lot of failure for a while until you build up some technical skill so that you can begin having success. So white belt's a hard belt. White belt is also the belt at which you're going to learn more than at any other phase of your journey. Why? Because eventually the journey of Jiu-Jitsu becomes one of refinement. You know, you've amassed a lot of knowledge, a lot of technical knowledge, and you've amassed some skill. Well, the goal should be to just refine and refine and refine and get better and better and better. But at white belt, you have very little knowledge yet. There is a vast amount of stuff that you have to learn, and so you're going to have to really be a good student as a white belt, a good training partner, a good student, someone that asks questions, someone that shows up like a sponge, because there is a ton of stuff to know. So what do you need to know at white belt? And by the way, when I say what do you need to know at white belt, what I'm referring to is what do you need to know in order to get to blue belt? Or if I say, what do you need to know at blue belt? I mean, what do you need to know in order to get to purple belt? So we're always talking about, the next belt that you're working toward. So let me throw on the screen what my requirements are for those students that I've promoted to blue belt. And, I'm in the Roy Dean lineage, and I run my promotions very similar to how he does. And so my requirements are pretty similar to his. And so this is unique to my lineage. This doesn't necessarily apply to other schools or other lineages, so take it with a grain of salt. But this is, should be something in the ballpark of what every white belt should know in order to get to blue belt. Okay, 4 mount escapes. That means 4 different ways of escaping the mount. For example, you could have a trap and roll, or maybe a self-defense style trap and roll, or maybe a foot lift, or a foot drag mount escape. You should be able to demonstrate a variety of ways of escaping the mount. Same thing with side mount. You should be able to demonstrate 4 different ways to get out of side control. Why? Because, one way doesn't always work. You need a variety of tools in your toolbox. We place a lot of emphasis at white belt on learning how to escape headlocks, because especially for self-defense, headlocks are really kind of a universal thing that you see out there, and you should know how to deal with people when they are aggressively trying to grab onto your neck. Wrestler's cradle escape we also require at white belt leading up to blue belt, because that's a common control position that wrestlers like to employ. 4 closed guard passes, you should be able to pass the guard in a variety of ways. 4 closed guard sweeps, you should be able to sweep in a variety of ways. 2 open guard sweeps, you should be able to employ some sweeps when you're playing some type of open guard, whether it's De La Hiva or lasso or spider, and so on. 2 throws, typically that means judo throws. 3 takedowns, usually that means wrestling style takedowns, like a single leg and a double leg, maybe a fireman's carry. 4 chokes from guard. It can be a cross collar choke, it can be a triangle choke, it can be a fist choke, an Ezekiel choke, and so on. 4 chokes from mount, and really most of the chokes that you find in guard, they tend to work from mount as well, so those are pretty similar. 4 arm locks from guard. It can be the classic straight arm lock, it can be an omoplata, it can be a kimura, it can be a reverse arm lock. 2 arm locks from mount. 2 chokes from the back. It could be a rear naked choke, it can be a bow and arrow, and so on. 2 back escapes. I think it's important to be able to escape to the weak side and escape to the strong side. And lastly, 4 leg locks. In my lineage, we teach leg locks from day 1, so you should have the ability to demonstrate the 4 most common leg locks, which would be a straight ankle lock, a knee bar, a toe hold, and a heel hook. That's a lot. That is a lot to learn at white belt. And that's why I think that you learn more at white belt than at any other phase of your journey, because you're learning big stuff, big concepts, major positions, and you're learning a technical repertoire that's foundational to jiu-jitsu. So what should you focus on a white belt? Well, you need to focus on being a good student. You need to focus on being a sponge. You need to try to ask questions of your coaches, ask questions of your training partners. You should have a notebook with you, make notes after every class so you can remember what it was that you drilled, so that you can go home and maybe watch a little YouTube, do a little further study on the stuff that you're learning in class. It's really a time where you just need to be a fully engaged, fully immersed student in order to get to that next level, because there's a lot to know to get to blue belt. The blue belt I find to be the most interesting belt because it's the belt that's going to require the greatest transformation in your game. The blue belt is, on the one hand, it's a relatively easy belt to achieve. It's pretty straightforward what you need to know to be a blue belt and the level at which you need to roll to be a blue belt. But in order to get a purple belt, you have to take yourself from that advanced beginner stage of the new blue belt to being an immature advanced player as a new purple belt. And the way that an advanced player approaches the game of jiu-jitsu is very different than the one-dimensional way that a beginner approaches the game of jiu-jitsu. What is that difference? Well, one of the difference is your ability to use momentum and to utilize your opponent's energy to help you, or your own momentum. The key to being efficient in jiu-jitsu in the ways that you move your body is generating momentum. You can generate it with your own body, learning to fling your legs and riding that momentum, or you can learn to use it in a more sophisticated way, which is riding other people's momentum. And that's how you become very efficient in your transitions. The other thing about the purple belt is the purple belt should have the ability to utilize combinations of techniques. It's no longer about a single dimension attack or a single dimension counter or a single dimension defense. It's about having, 1-2 punches. It's about, being able to attack for something, understanding the ways in which your opponents typically will defend that thing, so that you then have the follow-up that you can apply in response to their defense of your original attack. And so it becomes much more sophisticated in the way you play the game of jiu-jitsu. And that transition is something that it just takes a while, because the new blue belt is still in technique accumulation mode. It's a continuation of the white belt journey, which is one of massive technique accumulation. You're always looking for that next technique, that next submission, that next escape, that next transition, that next sweep. You're constantly on the hunt for more and more and more, because because there's a lot to know. And because that next technique might be the technique that saves you, right? You're always looking for that next technique that's going to give you some success against your training partners who are also learning lots and lots of new stuff as well. But at some point in your blue to purple journey, you will usually have an epiphany, and the epiphany is that you don't need to learn more and more and more and more. What you need to do is go deeper into the details of the techniques that you already know, because that's what gives you effectiveness. A black belt is effective because they have the details so well honed. They've got the timing, the sensitivity, everything is honed at a very high level. Even though the black belt might be employing very simple fundamental techniques, it's the details that allow you to be successful in jiu-jitsu. And the new purple belt should have the ability to play the game in the way that a black belt plays the game of jiu-jitsu, using momentum, using combinations, using, more fluid transitions, and so on. And so back to my lineage, what we require for our blue belts earning their purple belts, we require them to demonstrate a whole bunch of individual techniques, but we also require them to build 10 multi-technique combinations. So 10 combinations, 10 techniques that have a variety of components to them. And I'll throw on the screen here what I did when I earned my purple belt, so you can see some of the combinations. Now, from blue to purple, the combinations don't have to be particularly deep. They don't have to be techniques that have 6 or 7 segments on them. They can be 1, 2, 2, 3, 4 technique combinations at purple. So what should you be working on if you're a mid to late stage blue belt, working up to the purple belt? Well, you should really flowchart out your game. You should have a deeper understanding of your game. You should have more components in your game that you can follow up with. Let's say you pass the guard in a particular way, and typically people will defend in a certain way, or they'll use 1 or 2 different ways of defending that. Well, you've got something in response to those 2 ways that people use to defend. And then they might have a couple ways that they defend the thing that you've defended their last thing. And you have another couple things that you can employ onto that. So you're thinking strategically, you're thinking in terms of moves and goals that are several steps ahead, so that it's no longer about a single dimension attack or a single dimension defense. That's what you really need to be working on as a blue belt leading up to purple belt. That and really getting your movement elegant and fluid so that your transitions can be efficient, your movements can be efficient, and utilizing your opponent's momentum, learning to sweep with momentum, learning to play with people's center of gravity, and playing with that kazushi. I mean, these are all the things that you'll get much, much better at as you get to purple belt. So that would be my recommendation of what you need to work on. Purple belt. The purple belt journey to brown belt is really one of refinement, one of seeking depth in your game, depth in your understanding. It's one in which you're attempting to be more efficient in your movements, efficient in your execution, so you can get the tap without working as hard. And it's also that purple to brown transition is where you really start learning to vary the tempo at which you play the game of jiu-jitsu. When you're white belt, you go 1 speed, which is hard, right? As a blue belt, you tend to have 1 speed as well. Maybe you don't go quite as hard as you did at white belt because you have more skill now and you don't have to go quite as hard to be effective. But by the time you get to purple belt, you really need to start learning to play with that tempo. You don't need to play the game at 1 speed. In fact, you shouldn't play the game at 1 speed, because tempo is an ingredient that allows you to have more success. Maybe you need to hit the accelerator to get that guard pass, and then you dial back the intensity a little bit so that you can be a little bit more incremental. You establish a position, establish your connection points, and then you increment your way to that next position. So you should have the ability to play kind of a soft game When you need to be soft, you should have the ability to play a more pressure-oriented game when you need to play a more pressure-oriented game, and you should have the ability to vary the speed at which you're executing. So you can have a quick and nimble game at times or a slow and incremental game. And that's a real important part, I think, of getting to the truly advanced level game where you're playing not only with combinations of techniques and momentum and, the higher level elements of jiu-jitsu, but you're also playing around with the tempo as well in order to have more success. So that's a big part of the purple to brown journey. And then really it's just the depth that you're looking for. You're trying to map out all of the techniques that you utilize from every position, defensively, offensively, and create connections between them, make them more interconnected, make things more fluid, more fluent, more precise in your movements. And so those are really the things that I think you should work on as a purple belt leading to brown belt. I think a lot of that happens just as a result of showing up to class frequently and continuing to, think a lot about the game of jiu-jitsu and how you express your jiu-jitsu, and always seeking the technical response to the problems you're facing and not the physical response, so that you can develop more effectiveness without requiring as much in terms of physical attributes. So that's what I would say about the purple belt to brown belt journey. Brown belt is, to me, two things. The brown to black belt journey is one in which you are attempting to apply pressure from everywhere. And it's also the period in your game where you're looking for a completeness in your game. In order to get the black belt, you can't have any glaring holes in your game. You should be fairly well-rounded and you should be fairly effective from everywhere. There's a tendency in jiu-jitsu to strengthen our strengths and to minimize our weaknesses. And so as a result, we tend to play our A game a lot. That's real common. People will just play their A game. Well, the A game is just a subset of the overall knowledge base that you have in jiu-jitsu. I think there are three games: the A game, the B game, and the C game. All techniques start out as C techniques because you don't know them very well yet. Eventually, those C-level techniques will bubble up with practice to being a B-level technique. A B-level technique is a technique that you know pretty well, technique that you hit now and again. It's a technique that is part of your arsenal, but it's not really your go-to in crunch time when you really need to get the job done. That's what your A game consists of. But these things are not fluid or not static. They're fluid. They're constantly changing positions and shifting around. Something, if you work on something from your C technique list, it'll bubble up to being a B technique. Maybe something from your A technique, your A game, you don't really look for it as much anymore because you don't find yourself in those positions as much as you did earlier in your journey. So maybe that technique drops off and it becomes kind of a B-level technique because you just don't look for it as much anymore. And so these things kind of change positions a lot. But as a brown belt leading to black belt, you really shouldn't have any C techniques. Mostly. You should have mostly B techniques and A techniques. Your A techniques are the stuff you do the very best. Everything else should basically be a B technique or close to it. At least that's the goal. Nobody's perfectly balanced in jiu-jitsu. Black belts aren't perfectly balanced, meaning you're equally effective, top, bottom, offensive, defensive. But brown belt is really where you take a good, hard look at your game, identify the areas that you've neglected, and begin spending some time there shoring those things up. And this can be hard as a brown belt because it means you have to let yourself be vulnerable. If you don't play leg locks as much, well, now's the time to play leg locks, but you're not going to be as effective doing those things as you would be playing your A game, which means you now have to suppress your ego and be willing to have some failure while you improve your game. So that's number one. The second thing is pressure. Brown belts should be able to apply pressure from anywhere, top or bottom. How do you apply pressure? A lot of the application of pressure is simply having strong connection points, having multiple connection points, so that you are always either pushing or pulling, or in combination. You're using your legs to push, you're using your arms to pull. There's always tension being applied to the things that you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to set up an arm bar. Well, you're applying pressure to that arm. You're controlling it very forcefully and with good mechanics, obviously. I'm not talking about strength. I'm talking about good mechanics, leverage, angles, positioning. You're trying to control that arm. You're trying to swivel into position, leaving no gaps whatsoever so that your opponents don't even get the opportunity to defend those techniques. And that's what pressure really is. Pressure isn't just putting your weight on someone, although that can be a form of pressure. Pressure is more in terms of the application of force throughout the entire execution of that technique. And so a brown belt should have the ability to apply a lot of pressure from all over the place. So those are the two things I would say about the brown belt journey. And what should you focus on? Well, you should focus on applying pressure from everywhere. If you're kind of loose in certain places, you got to tighten those things up. And then number two is you need to attempt to complete yourself and become as well-rounded as possible. One of the ways you can do that is by teaching, and brown belt is usually the belt at which students begin to teach, especially the ones that want to go on to have their own schools. When I was a brown belt, I opened my academy in Wyoming, and so that was for me a huge part of getting to the next level, was learning to bring people up and teach the art of jiu-jitsu, because in teaching something, that's where you really expose the depth that you have an understanding of that thing. So the brown belt is really finishing school. It's where you polish everything up and you get yourself ready for the ultimate goal, which is earning your black belt. Black belt. Let me just talk a little bit about my personal subjective experience as a black belt and the things that I feel compelled to work on in my own game. That's all I can do. I don't claim to speak for other black belts. I don't claim to be the definitive source on what you're supposed to be working on as a black belt. The black belt is a vast belt, and there is a huge difference between a new black belt and someone that's been a black belt for a decade or two or three or four or five. So I don't want to claim any sort of knowledge about that other than my own personal experience. In my opinion, the biggest impulse is one of attempting to simplify your game. By the time you get to black belt, you have had a million battles. You've wrestled against every body type, every strategy, big people, small people, fast, athletic people, unathletic people, women. You have wrestled everybody, and you have been through all the phases of your journey, the blue belt blues, the purple belt phase, the brown belt. You've been through all that. And by the time you get to black belt, what you're really attempting to do is strip away everything that's non-essential in your own game, leaving just this perfect core in your game, this perfect game that you can execute efficiently and with a lot of effectiveness without having to work as hard. And so it's really one of wanting to become maximally effective with minimal exertion, or maximally effective with beautiful transitions, effortless transitions, recognition of those openings very early on, recognition of those windows of opportunity when they're just beginning to develop, and just having great timing and great sensitivity. So for me, really, I think the greatest impulse is one of wanting to just shave and round the corners and become more and more efficient, more and more effective, learning to do more and more and more with less and less and less so that you can eventually have some, perfect execution of jujitsu. That's the holy grail. Perfect jujitsu that requires no strength, no athleticism, that has perfect timing. Jiu-jitsu in which you can submit people that are vastly stronger and more physical than you by having perfect technique. And so that becomes the never-ending quest. And it's really one, as a black belt, about small improvements and filling small gaps. Nobody's perfectly balanced. We all have gaps. We all have areas in our game that could use improvement. But at black belt, they're not big, huge gaps. They're little tiny ones. It might be one particular defense from one particular position is causing you a little bit of trouble. Okay, well, you focus on that for a little bit. Or it could just be one, transitional sequence in one scenario in which you use that sequence, but it's not as good as it could be. So you focus on that a little bit. So the projects, they become smaller. They also become projects based on your own personal interest. You might have a deeper interest in the leg lock game. Well, you create your own projects to do deeper dives into those areas. So you're always, as a black belt, working on little projects, little areas of study, little areas of self-directed study and self-directed work. And that's real common. But all of that, I think, within this desire to have a perfect game in which you can tap people effortlessly. And that's the holy grail. I mean, very few practitioners ever truly get to that level. But that's, I think, what we're all working for. So I hope this helps you in your own journey. And I appreciate you watching the channel. And we will talk next time.